Welcome back to The Explainer. Okay, we've got a seriously fascinating piece of geopolitical history on deck today. We're going to trace roughly 2,000 years of geography and diplomacy to figure out exactly how the Sino-Indian border conflict actually started. It's a story of ancient history, colonial mapmaking, and modern state building all crashing into each other. So think about this. How does a 2,000-year-old, totally peaceful mountain barrier suddenly turn into a modern flashpoint? I mean, for millennia, the towering Himalayas weren't a war zone. Not at all. They were basically a giant bridge for trade and religion between India, Tibet, and China. You had Buddhist monks walking the routes, traders moving goods, and literally zero political disputes. So how in the world did we get from that ancient peaceful exchange to the massive tensions we see today?
Well, to answer that, we need to look at our first section, the ancient natural boundary. Imagine a time when the actual physical Earth set the boundaries, not a pen and paper. The key idea here is the watershed principle. For over 2,000 years, India and China just mutually respected the Himalayan watershed as their frontier. Basically, the Karakoram Range and the highest Himalayan crests acted like a perfect natural wall separating the river systems of India and Central Asia. It was this unspoken agreement, completely unmarked but defined by nature itself. But fast forward to the modern era, and you've got two completely different political philosophies colliding head-on. On one side, there's the modern European concept, which the British brought over to India, of drawing rigid, fixed lines on a map to define a nation-state. On the flip side, you have the traditional Chinese tributary system. In this ancient setup, China treated its neighbors more like vassals under Chinese suzerainty, rather than, diplomatic equals with hard borders. They literally couldn't conceive of diplomatic parity in the Western sense. It was just a massive clash of worldviews.
Which perfectly tees up Section 2, drawing lines on maps.
All right, so in the 19th and early 20th centuries, colonial powers, mainly Britain, tried to actually stick these massive mountain ranges onto paper. In the Western sector, it got super messy. Back in 1865, a survey officer named W.H. Johnson mapped out the really desolate Aksai Chin region and drew up the Johnson Line, basically handing this giant, freezing desert over to Kashmir. But the British weren't even on the same page about this. A few decades later, they started sweating over Russian expansion, so the 1899 Macartney-MacDonald Line proposed splitting the territory, leaving most of Aksai Chin in Chinese hands. It was basically a giant cartographic guessing game played from thousands of miles away. And spoiler alert, it planted the seeds for some major disputes later on. Now, let's swing over to the east for the other half of this puzzle, the McMahon Line. In 1914, at the Simla Convention, a British negotiator named Henry McMahon decided to establish a border. But here's the crazy part. He completely bypassed China and just negotiated directly with Tibet. With a stroke of a pen, McMahon pushed the boundary roughly 60 miles north, right up to the highest Himalayan ridges. China, viewing Tibet as very much part of its realm, completely rejected this agreement.
So, we have ambiguous lines in the west and completely rejected lines in the east. Let's move to Section 3, the disappearing Tibetan buffer.
Right around the mid-20th century, that ancient geographic safety net we talked about just totally collapsed. In 1949, the People's Republic of China is formed. And almost immediately, in 1950, the People's Liberation Army crosses into Tibet. This was a monumental, game-changing shift. Overnight, the giant Tibetan buffer zone that had kept the Indian and Chinese empires apart for millennia, gone, erased. Suddenly, you have two massive, newly formed modern states forced into direct physical contact along a border that nobody really agreed on. This sudden proximity meant both sides really had to start checking their maps, bringing us to Section 4, the strategic Aksai Chin. Now, if you just look at the Aksai Chin Plateau, it seems like a completely barren 18,000-foot-high desert locked between the Queen Lin and Karakoram mountains. The British actually described it back in the day as being of no value, but in the modern era of the 1950s, this absolutely brutal terrain held the key to immense strategic power for the new Chinese government. And the reason was pure logistics. China desperately needed a physical highway connecting their western Xinjiang province down into Tibet to supply their forces and consolidate control. The best way to do that was straight through Aksai Chin. So between 1954 and 1959, they secretly built this massive road right through the plateau. The huge problem here? Indian maps, which were relying on that old 1865 Johnson Line, claimed that exact territory as their own. That secret construction job kicks off Section 5, a timeline of mistrust. You can practically feel the pressure building through the century. We've got the 1914 Simla Agreement that China rejected, the formation of the PRC in 49, and the occupation of Tibet in 50.
Then, in 1954, India and China signed the Panchsheel Agreement. India formally recognizes Chinese control over Tibet, really hoping to just buy some peace and secure a friendly neighbor to the north. But they fatally left the massive border ambiguities completely unresolved. Both sides were smiling for the cameras, signing treaties, while literally looking at two entirely different maps.
Everything finally boils over at the 1959 breaking point. A huge uprising against Chinese rule erupts in Lhasa, Tibet. The Dalai Lama is forced to flee, and India actually gives him asylum, which completely infuriates Beijing. And right around this exact same time, Indian patrols finally discover that strategic highway China had been secretly building through Aksai Chin. The whole era of bye-bye, that brotherly friendship, shattered overnight. Formal protests start flying, the very first border clashes happen, and the dispute is officially out in the open. What we're left with are two completely incompatible realities. You've got China fundamentally rejecting those old colonial-era lines and claiming huge tracts of the Northeast Frontier Agency and the Aksai Chin region based on their own historical interpretations and strategic needs. On the flip side, you have India rigidly defending the highest crest principle of the McMahon Line in the east and the Johnson boundary in the west, viewing them as firmly established, traditional borders. There was absolutely zero overlapping middle ground.
To kind of sum up this whole tragic arc, we started with an ancient friendship, 2,000 years of civilizational ties and trade across a natural mountain barrier. Then, that morphed into different clashing perceptions between British mapmaking and traditional Chinese tributary systems. And finally, the total erasure of the Tibetan buffer triggered a full-blown border crisis. Thousands of years of peace degraded into total strategic mistrust in just a single decade. Ultimately, unclear borders plus strategic mistrust almost always equals a massive risk of conflict. The collision of ancient geography, colonial cartography, and modern state building literally paved the tragic road to the 1962 Sino-Indian War. But it leaves us with kind of a haunting question today. In a world still completely scarred by poorly drawn colonial maps, how many other peaceful barriers are out there, just waiting to become tomorrow's flashpoints? Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer, and keep learning.